other term before, gitawag siya Roman revival. They revived the Roman architecture or copied some of its uh, important not necessarily the structures, but the important aspect of its structures. So murag ilang gikopya. So murag gitawag na siya Roman-like. So it refers to the architecture of the 11th and 12th centuries in medieval Europe to Roman architecture based on similarities of forms and materials. So again, no, ang pagka-Roman-like nila, it's more on the forms, building forms, and the materials that they are using. Okay. So here, I've got this from a certain reference. Romanesque architecture is an architectural style in Europe from about the mid-11th century to the advent of Gothic architecture. Wait, nagsugod na ba ito o recording? Yeah, thank you sa record na. Okay, so the next term here, a fusion of Roman, Carolingian, and Ottonian, Byzantine, and local Germanic traditions. It was a product of the great expansion of monasticism in the 10th to 11th century. So fusion meaning it's a combination, murag unsay ilang nakuha nga info from the Roman, and actually this Carolingian and Ottonian, some of these buildings that occurs on this era also, these two, kani silang duha, no? These two are small era. Murag gagmay bitaw sila nga era na you cannot quantify it as a type of era na affects the whole timeline of architecture. No, there are those kanang era of architecture nga ni-occur sila in some place but it never really kanang wala sila nihatag og iyan kadako nga impact on the whole or in the history of architecture. But still, ni-occur siya. And if you go research deeper on those type of architectures, naa na sila meaning, na sa examples and so on and so forth. But this one, Carolingian and Ottonian, actually some of these buildings in this era are actually belongs into Romanesque architecture. So again, no, a fusion meaning a combination no, of Roman architecture, Carolingian and Ottonian, Byzantine, and local Germanic traditions. So those local German designs during that time, during the 11th or 10th century, ila sa nang gipangkuha and included here in Romanesque architecture. So larger churches were needed to accommodate the numerous monks and priests, as well as the pilgrims who came to view saints' relics. So this time, nanay mga rebolto or kanang mga statues this time around the Romanesque. During the early Christian manggod and partly in Byzantine, what they do is paintings, murals, frescoes, and so on and so forth. So this time around, nanay mga saints relics or kanang mga statues. So they need a larger churches. So in this part or in this era of architecture, daghan kayo mga natukod nga mga church. Kaya nga naman, early Christian, medyo gamay pa ang Christianity nga community that time. And then during the Byzantine, ni dako maayo. Pero dili pa gyud completely na nindako, no? And during the Romanesque architecture, kana medyo ni-radiate na gyud ang Christianity, murag ning katag na maayo within the Europe area. And then kita na after ani usapatan na sakop sa Christianity. Around 1500 man ta, 15th century man ta na visit ni Magellan and the group, di ba? So medyo late na ta na conquer or na naabdan sa Christianity. Okay, so for the sake of fire resistance, masonry vaulting began to replace timber construction. Why? They get this idea that some of the churches in Byzantine and early Christian architecture, especially in early Christian architecture, di ba, naka-truss roofing to sila. Those truss roofs, katong mga karaan nga roof, timber man to silang construction, timber, kahoy, dali masunog. Or if ever na mga riot-riot, di ba? So masunog siya dayon, maguba lang church. So this time around, they've learned, which is that's the reason why we study history of architecture, because we have to apply what had happened in the past and should not happen nowadays in our designs. So during their time, that's what they do. They study what are the previous architecture era, nganong iyan na ilang design, and how can they improve it. So how did they improve it? They use masonry vaulting. Masonry meaning dili na siya kahoy. It's the use of bricks, it's the use of concrete, it's the use of concrete blocks, and so on and so forth. Okay, so to have a view more on this Carolingian and Ottonian, even though these are small architecture eras, ako sa na siyang gi-appeal, no? Na akong giapas, medyo mga bago lang, mga 10 minutes ago ako nang join nga sa discussion. So here, Carolingian architecture, dili na kay gikan sa San Carlos. Carolingian is the style of North European pre-Romanesque architecture belonging to the period of Carolingian Renaissance of the late 8th and 9th centuries, when the Carolingian dynasty dominated West European politics. Okay, so itawag yun siya pre-Romanesque. So it was a conscious attempt to emulate. So again, gikopya nila ang Roman architecture. And to that end, it borrowed heavily from early Christian and Byzantine architecture. So what they do is, kopya sila sa Roman architecture, and then kuha sila og mga ideas from early Christian and Byzantine. So since nabilong man sila sa iana nga era, Carolingian Renaissance or Carolingian dynasty, so gitawag siya og Carolingian architecture. But those are just really small architecture, and since gipang-copy ra man nilang styles, they don't have distinct styles. Ano lang siya, it's not a bigger era nga ni affect gyud sa tibuok history of architecture, but still ni-exist na siya nga type of architecture. Okay. Another one is the Ottonian architecture. So this is an architectural style which evolved during the reign of Emperor Otto the Great. So this one is in Germany actually. So the style was found in Germany and lasted from the mid-10th century until the mid-11th century. So Ottonian architecture draws its inspiration from Carolingian and Byzantine architecture. So if you notice, gipang kopya ra gyapon, no, from the other types of architecture, the Carolingian and the Byzantine architecture. So you can notice here sa examples. Going back, no, kaning example, this is the Lorsch Abbey. So makita nimo arches gyapon, di ba? Na mga semi-domes here. I mean, semi-circular apse right here, but it's not an apse, pero gikan na siya sa apse nga idea. Same with this part. This one is actually a basilica. So instead of having timber roofs, this one is actually masonry roofing na niya. Okay. This one here is Church of Saint Syracuse. Nadyo sa akong notes na akong gibutan. Church of Saint Syracuse in Germany. Same with this one. This is also in Germany. This is the Saint Michael Church in Hildesheim. Di ko ba sa bubasa ni mga German na terms. So these are examples of Ottonian architecture. Okay, so again, no, going back from the term itself, Romanesque architecture, it means Roman-like. And the type of architecture, the Romanesque architecture, is a fusion, meaning it's a combination of the previous architectural styles, which is the Roman, early Christian, Byzantine, and also partly these two small architecture eras, which is the Carolingian and Ottonian. So pila ka book ilang gimix? Roman, early Christian, Byzantine, Carolingian, and Ottonian. So 5 ka book ilang gimix. So gimix nila na, gifuse, gikuha nila ang mga og sa kuan ba gikuha nimo ang best practices ana nga type of building or the best features of that building of that era and use it. Create a new church, create a new building, having those ideas already from the previous era of architecture and improve it. So that's what they did during the Romanesque architecture. Okay, so geographical influence, actually here, combination of Roman Byzantine, basically in Roman style. Actually, geographically, Romanesque architecture happens in all of Europe. And later on, gidalasad na sa mga priest, sa mga nag-conquer sa other places. Like for example, during the Christianity invasion by the Spaniards here sa Philippines, when they created the churches, nadala nila ning mga Romanesque architecture. So, in terms of geography, it happens in Europe, the whole continent of Europe. Okay, so for geological influence, so geology, ilang mga materials, the most common material used for stone, bricks, marble, or terracotta, as well as ready-made columns and features from the old Roman buildings. So katong mga buildings nga mga naguba na during katong mga Roman architecture, so they reuse it, gigamit nila for the new buildings. So again, kompleto na sila guys. Naana sila stone, brick, marbles, terracotta, and so on and so forth. It's because this type of architecture happens in the whole Europe. So pwede na sila, it's not the same with Byzantine nga focus on that Byzantium, on that Constantinople in area. This one, medyo dako kayo ang scope, dako kayo ang site, dako kayo ang area. So in terms of materials, lahi-lahi. So, nauban ni gamit og bricks, nauban ni gamit og terracotta, marbles, so on and so forth. So, for the climatic influence, okay, so sa climate, we have here, if ang Europe, dako man gid ang Europe nga continent, if imo ra siyang tungaon, if you have it, the northern portion is actually a dull climate contributed to the use of large windows to admit light, high-pitched roof to throw off rain and snow. So, ang pinaka-upper portion, mag-snow nga to, mag-uwan, and then those parts in Europe medyo gamay ra. There are those areas na gamay ra ilahang time of day nga naa sila light. It's not the same with ours na kanang atong equal, okay, since naman ta sa equator, di ba, equal ang atong day and night. So that is why in their design, they use large windows to admit light. And then they also have high-pitched roof to throw off rain and snow. So in this example, dagko ilang mga windows. This one here, windows ni siya. And notice, unsa ka steep ang ilahang roof. No? Ang ilang slope, grabe. Grabe ka steep. So, inig mag-uwan or mag-snow, di na siya mo store nga na. So, mo slide na diretso. Here, in the southern portion, so sa ubos nga part, this part right here, init na siya. Dry portion. Pero, I mean, dili init, init, but dry areas, pero dili mag-uwan. Pero, di sa siya nga naka-humid. There's a difference between a humid country pero may ka kanang imong feeling kay pero may ka kanang panington and so on and so forth. There are areas nga sunny, dry, pero dili siya humid. So that's the southern portion. So what they do is they can have this small windows to minimize sun and shading. So if you notice this building here, gamay kay windows, no? Mo siya presuhan no gamay kay mga windows and so on. It's not nga di sila ganahan makita sa view outside, but it's their way of protecting themselves from the heat of the sun and also to have a good shade on the interior part of the building. And since dili mag-uwan nga to, dili mag-snow, what they have here is flat roof. So again, no, our design is not just on the history sa mga nakita nato sa ubang buildings. Today, if mag-design mo, there's always a reason why you choose that kind of roofing. So, for example, if you're using gable, if you're using flat roof, if you're using shed type of roof, you always have a reason why. It's either climatic, pwede po. Lastly na lang gidang makaingon ka nga for aesthetic purposes. Lastly na gina siya. Ihatag nga reason. Nganong nag-flat roof man ka sa imuhang design plate? For aesthetic na sir, para nindot tanan. Lastly na siya nga reason. There's always another reason, like you have this because you will use that in the future and so on and so forth. So again, no? Lastly, ang aesthetic, but first siya makita sa eye, no? Sa eye sa tao. Lastly, nimo siya i-consider in terms sa imuhang design, but make sure nga catchy sa ang aesthetics. Okay? Here, so in terms of religious influence, Christianity resulted into erection of church. Papacy had great power and influence. So this time around, nanay mga kanang sa Pope, no? So sa Rome, sa Vatican City, dako kayo og influence ang Pope in this time around. So ang Pope moingon nga sige, build a church there, build a church. So that's the influence that they have during the Romanesque architecture. That is why mostly churches in Europe, katong mga medyo karaan-karaan, is in Romanesque type of architecture. Pero daghan sa ang Gothic, which later on we will discuss, but there's a big chunk, no? If you count the number of churches in Europe, there's a big chunk na kana siya gi-design during the Romanesque era of architecture. So again, in terms of religious influence, dako kayo. It's because the buildings during the Romanesque architecture are mostly churches. Ang mga church lagit kasagaran. Okay, so that's the religious influence. How about here? Social and political influence. So during the Romanesque architecture, in terms of social and political influence, this is the time na gi-establish ang feudal system or the landlord, which the landlord kanang nakay king, nakay king, queen, nakay mga big boss. So the landlord built castle to separate them and protect them from the peasants. So this castle was made with man-made canals. So this means that in Romanesque architecture, it's not just the churches for the gathering, no, in Christianity, dili lang kay church, but nasa day mga castles. So nga rin nagsugod ang mga castles in Europe. So why? It's because this is the time nga ni nagsugod ang feudal system, or what we call the feudalism. So meaning ang feudalism here, if makita ninyo, hopefully makita na king. After sa king, nato yung mga lords, di ba? After na, kaya nato yung mga knights na mag-support ang mga lords, and lastly ang pinakaubos na diha ang mga peasants, or what you call the servants, the farmers, if the hierarchy kani ang pinakadato, kani ang pinaka poor, or the kanang gud nagwork for this type of person right there above. So since king ka, di ba, king, or you are the lord of that place, nai-build nga building para nimo, diya ka magpuyo, di ba? So those are castles. So castles are designed para i-protect i-protect ning mga king. Kaya syempre siguro na mga servants or na mga farmers nga wala na tarong og sweldo, basig mo kuanto, basig mo makigrayot or makigwelga, di ba? So dapat protected ang king. So the castles are built like this. Now later on we will discuss how they built the castles. Actually, makita niyo sa mga movies, di ba? How they created the castles, protected gyud ang king. So that's the time na itawag na siya feudalism or the feudal systems. Okay, so far any questions? So again, no, in terms of geographical influence, Romanesque architecture happens in Europe, in the whole continent of Europe. In terms of its geological, ang iyang material, bricks, stones, terracotta, diba? So those are the materials that they used. In terms of religion, syempre Christianity during this time. No, and highly highly influential ang papacy or the Pope. So the Pope has the power uh, to decide na mo na siya, and then build a church right there. So in terms of Romanesque architecture, the Pope has a big influence. And in terms of social and political influence, this is also the time in continent of Europe nga nag-start ang feudalism. So there's a king, there's the lord that serves the king. Bali ang king dako na siya, no? Dako ang iyang gi-carry nga area. So siguro in every town butangan niyang mga lord. Dahil kato nga lord kay mga knights para pag-support, para pag safeguard sa king and also the lord itself. And on the last of this pyramid or triangle right here na mga farmers. So with this type of politics during this time, naka-create ni siya og type of architecture or partly Romanesque architecture, and they've created this building nga mga castles. Okay? So hopefully na-understand niyo, no? Geography, geology, climatic day, wala na ko na-include na climatic. In climatic, na duha, no? North, the northern portion and the southern portion. So the northern portion, uwanon sila, mag-snow sila, and gamay ra ilahang time of day na naay daylight. So what they do or what they did is naka-steep roofing, medyo grabe ka steep ilang roof, and large windows to admit the light. Sa southern portion, it's quite dry and sunny. So what they do is small windows only ang ilang building, and since dili mag-uwan, dili mag-snow, flat roof lang sila. Okay, so again, no, geography, geology, climatic, religious, and social and political influence. Hopefully ma-distinguish ninyo the 5 influences of this type of architecture. Okay. Questions with lang. I'll check if naamoy mga questions. Wow, good thing daghang mga nag-open o camera. Napipakape si Dominic, no? Okay. Nag-ready na gid ni sila sa ilahang exams. Good. Okay. Here. Next slide. Romanesque architecture. Unsay character sa Romanesque architecture? We all know nga ang character sa Byzantine, ka-remember pa mo sa Byzantine? Vertical, di ba? Verticality. Circular na siya, name mo na siyang circular or it's a focus sa iyang center. It's because of the dome. It's because the nave is at the center. Diba? Rich in interior and simple sa iyang exterior, diba? So those are the characters of Byzantine. Here, in Romanesque architecture, duha ang iyang gibutang ari. Sober and dignified. So, I think you're very familiar with this term, no? But it doesn't mean sober. Na mag-ubad ka ng sober. Kada bitong sa may term na ha. Kanang gikan bitaw ka na hangover niya, medyo sober na ko, brad, di ba? It doesn't mean like that, na. It's not the sober meaning. Here, the sober means solemn. Kada bitaw mag-ampo kanya, solemn kay kang mag-ampo. Formal and sincere. So, mo na siya yung meaning sa sober right here. So again, no, the sober here, the term sober means formal, solemn, and sincere. Dignified here, so from the term dignity and so on and so forth, showing characteristics of a serious manner and worthy of respect. So nga na siya, no? Sober and dignified. So an example, so sir, sober din na sir nga, basig hubog ro naghimo na sir, no? Kaya nitakilid mo yung building. The sober is on the design, but unfortunately, I think you're very familiar with this building. This is the Pisa Cathedral. This is one of the best example of Romanesque architecture. This one here, kani siya, medyo unfortunately, nalang gi problema sa iyahang soil. But they already corrected this one. Ilan na ning correct, and then even though pag-correct nila, ni-decide sila nga, man, ibalik na to pa straight, Brad, o patakilid lang. Siguro na sila, takilid lang siguro ba, kay sikat naman kaya ng building. So, but they have the chance actually nga ilang ibalik o pa straight. The Pisa Cathedral or this one. Later on, we will discuss that building. It's really a good example for Romanesque architecture, and it's kind of interesting. Mura siya ka nindot in terms of Hagia Sophia. Okay. So this one is an example of a sober and dignified. So if you noticed here, clean lines, ang iyahang the way pag-provide no sa mga arches are kanang same lang, no? Same, repetitive, no? Ang iyang pagkabutang. Okay, so what is the general appearance of wait lang, I need to So what is the general appearance of Romanesque architecture? So we have here 5, no? So dark and solemn spaces. So solemn meaning again, no? Solemn, sober, di ba? So mostly ang mga buildings ano niya is dark na siya. Dark, solemn spaces. The exterior is simple, severe. Severe here means very plain in style or appearance. Okay, so the severe term here is means very plain in style or appearance. So if unsay form, building form niya, and gamit siya mga arches, repetitive ang iyang design, and so on and so forth. Modest in terms of height. So it's not the same during the Byzantine nga ganahan sila magpataas. This time around, if unsay ilang need nga height for that building, they've done it. Nga na lang ang ilang gi-provide nga height. But actually, not all in Romanesque architecture nga ni-follow aning modest height. There are also cathedrals, there are also churches na medyo taas gud in terms of its height. The fourth one is horizontal lines. So if we go back, makita nimo ang mga horizontal lines right here, ang iyang pattern. No. Makita nimo. Why? Actually, those horizontal lines are very, very important since ang ilahang patterns is pataas. Diba? If you notice, ang iyang patterns pa repetitive, pataas. So to break that pattern, you also need these horizontal lines to balance your building, to balance it out. Dili sad kayo nga purely vertical na lang ang imong design sa imong structure. Okay, so again, dark, solemn spaces. Iyang interior. Medyo makahuna kasi imong mga kasalanan guro no if mo so nakadiri sa mga Romanesque architecture nga mga buildings. It's because it's dark and solemn. Exterior is simple, severe. Again, no? Severe here means plain in style or appearance. Simple lang. Simple. Modest in height. It's not that tall compared to other type of architecture. Like, for example, if you compared the Gothic, which ato pa nang i-explain on our next na to nga topic, mas taas gud ang Gothic architecture compared sa Romanesque architecture. So, mo nang gitawag siya modest in terms of height. Number 4, horizontal lines. So, sa iyang building, makikita na nimo ang pag-feature niya sa mga horizontal lines. And number 5, here, multiple units. We'll discuss this one in this next few slides. Here, it's an example, no? So, solemn, sober, diba? This picture here describes solemn, sober appearance. Why? It's because I think kani siya nga mga buildings is in the southern portion kanang gagmay og mga openings. So medyo dark. It's not the same with Byzantine architecture wherein di ba nasa like dome, and then kanilang dome on drums kay naay mga windows to let the natural light in. Same also with early Christian architecture, di ba? Kabantay mo sa early Christian architecture, ang ilahang apps kanang sa likod bitaw sa apps. Ang ilang apps kay nay mga windows para inigmisa, di ba? Ang ilang altar is facing the ano man, di ba, kanang morning sun. So ang ilang altar is facing the east, ang ilang entrance is facing the west. So during mass, first day or first parang pinakasayos buntag mo hayag ang morning sun. So musulod na sa ilahang windows. But here in Romanesque architecture, minimal ang ilang mga windows. So that is why they have this kind of feeling na sober and solemn. Okay? So here, no, examples, no, another examples that you can see. Di ba? Makita ninyo. Wala kayo siya yung mga openings. Just one here, another one here. Diri na gagmay opening. So these openings, mo na siya nakapangit-ngit sa iyang interior, which gives the feeling of, again, no, sober and dignified. Another example, yan na, no? Sir, ang pagka-sober and dignified na, sir, kaya ang pagkakuha mas picture. Medyo gloomy, di ba? So, again, if you notice, simple ang iyahang exterior line. And then, in terms of height, di kayo yan nakataas, modest in terms of height. It's not the same with Gothic, later on, Gothic architecture. Na grabe good kataas. This part right here, the last one, multiple units, we can describe it in this way. In Romanesque architecture, we have here the church, and part of the church, ni-extend siya. So that becomes a multiple unit and also changes the shape of the building, changes the shape of the church. Why? So let's just say, for example, kanang mga churches na to na influenced by Romanesque architecture. Let's just say the Basilica of Senor Santo Niño. So, di ba more or less ingani iyahang plano? The building here, right here, nanay mga katong asa nagpuyo ang mga or asa tong uban nga mga gipang storage room right here, I think. And then na courtyard, kabantay mo na courtyard gagamay. Dili katong main courtyard goods ato ba nga no, ug asa mag-held ang misa or asa katong na maligyag balon, no. In the inner portion of that Basilica of Senor Santo Niño, nanay gamay courtyard ngadto. So it's just the same with Romanesque architecture. It's not just the building or the church itself. There are other places nga ilang gipang add-on, which becomes it a multiple units. So why ngano yana? It's because they need that kind of space. Siguro additional space for that room, for the stock room, additional space for a congregation, for a meeting place, and so on and so forth. If you compare it to Gothic architecture, Gothic is one large space. Usa lang gyud ka buok nga dako kayo nga church and taas sad kayo nga church. So that is the difference between the Gothic and the Romanesque style in terms of planning. No, in terms of planning, Romanesque architecture is multiple units. Ana siya mga extend. Okay. So hopefully nakuha ninyo, no? Again, dark, solemn spaces. Exterior is simple, severe, modest height, horizontal lines, multiple units. So again, here the multiple units explains the way they plan their church. Okay. So here, what are the structures or unsay naa? So again, we all know sa other type of architecture, they have this church, they have these monasteries, di ba? In early Christian, they have church and baptisteries, di ba? Here, tulo na. Church, monastery, and castles. So again, nganong naay castles? It's because this is the time during the Romanesque architecture nga ni-occur ang feudalism or the feudal system wherein naay king, naay lords, naay mga knights, naay mga peasants. So these castles are built for the kings, no, to have this as their home, na safety sila. Okay, so for monasteries, it was designed as a microcosm, as the city of God. No? So they had several dependencies. So ang monastery is, you have the church, cloister, chapter room, abbot's house, monks, nuns rooms, prefectory, napagani hospital. So it's actually a complete complex of buildings, murag naatanan nga mga buildings to house all the needs of the kaniyang mga kaning mga pare, sa mga priest, also sa kanang mga bishops. So mo nang ni naigi-create nga mga monastery or monasteries, and most of these monastery or monasteries happens or was created during the Romanesque architecture. So again, no, unsa to siya nga mga types of buildings? We have the church, we have the monasteries, and we have the castles. For the church, it is the main building. It symbolized God's kingdom. The holiest part was the apse. It had cross shape. Symbolism was important, which is circular parts reflect perfection, so they were linked to God. Square parts are related to the human. No? So in this part right here, ang mga pa-curve guys, no? Ang pa-curve nga mga parts at church, that is, or that symbolizes or linked to God. So the square parts, kanang mga square or mga horizontal, vertical, those are symbolism or symbol for the human or for the users. Same ra bitaw sa mga buildings ni Gaudi. Are you familiar with Gaudi? Antonio Gaudi. Kailan mo ni Antonio Gaudi? Di ka kita og mga straight sa iyahang building. No? If you research Antonio Gaudi, if tanawan nimo yung mga design, kayo ka weird og mga design ng tawahan ay puro man mga paliko-liko. It's because ang iyahang murag theme or ang iyahang belief is ang iyahang mga designs is para sa God, and curved lines represents God. Muna ang thought ni or muna ang views ni Antonio Gaudi. Okay. Kailan man siguro mo ni Antonio Gaudi, no? I think I'm sure most of you guys are very familiar with Antonio Gaudi. Church. So characteristics of church, we have here monumental, trying to imitate the Roman models in the pilgrimage churches. Small in country churches. They were designed for advertising Catholic Church. They were lasting, which is made of stone, and the plans could be. So here in Romanesque architecture, there are three types of plan. It's not the same with early Christian architecture nga horizontal lang gid siya, no? Rectangular iyang plano. In Byzantine architecture is pa-circular siya. It's because kay nasa lay dome. So here in Romanesque architecture, since copy man siya, di ba? It's a fusion of those other architecture eras. So tanan nga plano ilang gi-apply here sa Romanesque architecture. So they have the Latin cross or the cruciform type of church plan. They have the polygonal or katong ilang nakuha sa Byzantine architecture. And we have here the basilican ilang nakuha sa early Christian architecture or Roman architecture. Again, no, the term basilica is from the Roman architecture. So here, monumental, so for bigger areas, kanang mga siguro mga dagko nga municipalities or cities, monumental ang ilang mga churches, dagko kay nga mga church. Say for example, no, the Pisa Cathedral, dako siya nga church. But there are those churches also in small areas, small countries, gagmay lang. So like for example, kanang mga Carolingian o mga Ottonian, mga gagmay to sila nga mga churches compared sa mga churches in bigger countries or ilahang mga cities. So it's just the same in terms of parts of the church. It's just the same. So again, hopefully nakastart na mo sa inyo ang sketch sa inyong Byzantine architecture. So floor plan and the section. So it's just like this, no? Pero Byzantine architecture siya. Pero mura siya ingani pagkahimo. So you will have here the central nave. You have here the transept. We have here the ambulatory, apse. Here na sila yung gipang introduce ng mga little apse. Sa ilang buildings na yung mga pa-curve nga rin. No? So, an apse, after the apse, napag yung mga little apse. Crossing right here. So, the crossing is actually the intersection of this transept and the nave. So, this center right here, that's the crossing. So, if kuan ni siya, if Byzantine architecture ni siya, kaning crossing or kaning part nga rin, nani dome, ko kay nga dome. In Romanesque architecture, naiuban gibutangan nila dome, partly, na dome, here sa crossing. We have this one, gitawag siya side nave, but actually these are aisles. Aisles, nave, aisles. Okay. Parts from the outside, so church, no, parts from the outside, makita nimo no, in terms of kaniyang view. So we have here the towers. We have here the clerestory. Unsa man ang clerestory, guys? What do you mean by clerestory? Are you familiar with clerestory? So clerestory kanang mga windows kanang nabitaw sa taas nga dili nimo ingon nga ma-open, ma-close. The main purpose of that window is just to admit light, admit natural light sa imong church. So that's what you call clerestory. We have here the arches separating the nave and the aisles.
Kaya tagagawin.
I'll like to mute lang no kinsa man yung mga nag-open of mic. Na may mga bad words. Ako lang i-mute ha. I think naka-mute naman siguro. Okay. So to continue, so again, no, in this slide, we can see here the parts of the church viewed outside. So unsay forma niya. No? So notice here sa crossing, dili na siya dome, but gitawag na siya og pyramidal na structure right here on top of the crossing. Pero nagyapon siya drums right here. So the transept, and then na siya gisawag og side doors. And then here we have the ambulatory here. And if you can see this little apse unsay iyang forma. So yan ano, may mga semi-circular right here. Okay. So again, no, there are three types of buildings or type of structures during the Romanesque architecture. Unsa ito? Church, monasteries, and castles. So ang monasteries during the Romanesque architecture is actually a complex composed of a lot of buildings nga nag-serve for the priest, for the bishops, ana nga lugar. So for example, asa man tatong picture. For example, here, no? This is what you call a monastery. So unsay nasa monastery na church mismo, ang church na ay kani mga abbot's house, ni mga monks or kanang para sa mga madre, di ba? Dapat gani hospital. So gitawag ni siya og monastery. So for the castles were defensive constructions. So they were fortified for providing shelter. The wall was one of the essential elements, especially this wall right here. No? Kabantay mo kana sa mga movies na diri ang mga archers, no? Kana mga magpana-pana, di ba? Na nga rin pita. Nya ang king kay nagid pinakasulod kayo no, safe kayo murag last na siya mapatay sa kanang mga movies, di ba? Kay nasa dress mga sword. Nya here kani nga portion right here nagpalibutan na siya og kanang moat, kana bitawng man-made nga river or kanang tubig, di ba? So that's how they design the castles. They tend to be built in steep areas, easier to defend. So di sila mag-build og castle sa mga areas nga alakan silang defense, di ba? So in terms of defense, maayo sila. So the location of their castles is actually very important. So ato sila ni provide sa mga hilly areas nga if na padung nga mga contract, they can easily see it. And the way they design their castles, their buildings, dali sad in terms of defense sa king here at the center. So later on, we will discuss the parts, part by part atong i-discuss ang castles. So what are the architectural elements in Romanesque architecture? So we have here 1, 2, 3, 4 round arches, barrel vaults, piers supporting vaults, and we have groin vaults. Okay, so round arches from the term itself, round. So kani palingin. No? So round arches, if imong buhatan og imaginary line right here, palingin na siya. Half circle. So gitawag siya round arches. So this one here is an example of a Romanesque architecture structure, Romanesque architecture design. Gitawag ni siya og Saint Pierre Moissac. So kani siya mo ni ang yahang portal, no? Murag before ka musod ngari ka mo ay sa kamo agi. So for a specific term, narthex, isuri mo na narthex na siya diha dapita. So the whole view of that church is actually like that, no? So kani siya gitawag ni siya og round arches right here. This one right here gitawag siya pointed arches. So actually Romanesque architecture is a combination of round arches and at the same time pwede po sila mogamit og pointed arches. Okay? So makita nimo no, simple right gyapon ang iyahang exterior. How about barrel vaults? So barrel vault, again, no? If you have an arc, you have another arc, you will connect the two arcs. So makahimo kag vault. So this one is what you call barrel vault. So this one, groin vault. This one is an example of a rib vault. So again, no? Barrel vault, groin vault, and rib vault. So here is an example of how a barrel vault looks like in actual, no? So if you notice this part right here, if I may sketch, asa naman tong sketch here. This one is an arc. This one is another arc right here. So when you connect that arc, you have this space right here nga nag-connect sa arc kani siya. So that is the vault. So gitawag na siya og barrel vault kay round arc man na siya. So again, no? That's the barrel vault. So ingana, no? A zoom up view. So naka-barrel vault siya. So if i-cut nimo, tanawon nimo yung section. So it's just a common arc. So here, right here, hallway nila ni padung adto. So naka-ano siya, naka-barrel vault. How about the pier supporting vaults? So this is the pier supporting vaults. This one right here. Kanang mga dagko kayo nga supports. So those are the piers nga nag-support sa vault. So again, they've created their roofing now by using masonry. It's not the same with early Christian architecture wherein the way or the type of construction ngayon ang gigamit is naka-truss, nigamit sila og kahoy, timber. So they've learned nga dali siya masunog, dili siya long lasting in terms of kanang if naay mga mo-oppose sa ana nga emperor dali maguba ang building kay syempre ang roofing dali na sunugon nila no. Panaon ra nila og katong naay fire, sunog na dayon ang roofing and the building will now get destroyed. So during the Romanesque architecture, they changed that type of roofing. So nigamit sila og masonry. And this masonry roofing, bugat kay na, press. Bugat kayo. It's not the kanang bricks nga imo makita nowadays nga nang nipis kayo. These bricks right here are really big, really thick and really heavy. So since bugat ang imong roofing, kaning structure, you need a bigger columns or what we call pier in order to support that one. So here makita nimo unsa ka dako ang column. So same ra na sa kana mag-design. So katong mga na-under nako sa design for naka-realize sila nga medyo challenge man gid ang pagbutang og columns sa design. And nasa uban mangutana like, sir, if ingani ka layo like 10 meters ang distance, mudako ba ang column? Syempre, di ba? Kay the bigger the distance, the heavier ang iyahang ma-carry nga load. Say for example here, ang gi-carry nga load ang gi-carry nga load ani nga pier is actually this one, kaninay arrow and kani akong gi-drawingan og red. So that's what you call tributary area. So katong mga naanay mga CE subjects, I think you're very familiar with what you call tributary area. So that's the area nga imong computon, which is mo na siya load nga i-carry aning certain part here sa column. So mo nang dagko kayo ang pier. Dili kay la daghan sila stones or daghan sila masonry. Ila lang gitapok-tapok. No, it's not the case. There's always a use nganong dako ng ilahang mga columns sa churches in order to support the superstructure or the structure above. So unsay forma ng mga piers supporting bolts. So it looks like this in actual na. Yan ay kadagko. Another picture, yung nakadako na. So this one here, nga rin na nag-start ang volt. This one here, makita niyo mo, nga rin na nag-start ang volt. Another type of volt is what we call groin volt. Or napaiuban, ribbed volt. So from the term itself, groin, I think you're very familiar na kung saan ang groin, di ba? So this one here is the groin. Kani siya. Groin. When man magka-groin ang volt, if you connect to duha ka buok barrel bolt, if mag-connect ka og duha ka buok barrel bolt, nananay groin sa iyahang iyang joint, sa iyang pag-join. So this is say for example here. This one, this one here really explains what's the difference between those bolts. So if you have a barrel bolt, syempre wala siya groin. It's just a very elongated. More siya, you have an arc right here, and then gi-elongate. No? Ug sa SketchUp pa na, nag-drawing kag arc na imong gi-push-pull. So nana kay barrel bolt, di ba? And then if you create two barrel bolt, na imuhang paaboton, that intersection right there is what you call groin. But still, this part, barrel bolt, yapon na siya, barrel bolt. This one right here is the groin bolt. This one. That's literally the groin. So, kabalo na mo, I think we're very familiar with aning term, diba? The groin. Okay. Rib bolt. So, for the rib bolt, in terms of using a round arc, is semicircular arc, you will use a pointed arc. So here, pointed siya. So that means na siya ay ridge or na siya ay rib. So this part right here is what you call the rib vault. And there are other types of vault, which is fan vault, which is, you cannot see this one here, this fourth example of vault or fourth type of vault. Hindi mo na siya makita in Romanesque architecture. You can see this type of vault in Gothic architecture. So again, no, ang Romanesque is kanira siyang tulo. Let me clear this one right here. Kanirang tulo ang Romanesque architecture. So again, no, unsay makita nimo sa Romanesque architecture, you can see barrel vault, groin vault, and rib vault. So in Gothic architecture, ngadto nimo makita ang fan vault. So ingani. So here, secondary rib, panels, and so on and so forth. So we will discuss this fan vault later on during the Gothic architecture. So here sa tunga, nasa gitawag og lozenge. Lozenge ang term. So unsay forma ng fan vault in actual? It looks like that. Ingana ka intricate pagkahimo, di ba? Okay. So this one right here, kani siya, this is now the lozenge. Actually, lozenge, dili siya kanang sa strepsils, di ba? Sa strepsils, di ba? One lozenge, one tablet. The lozenge here, actually, that means a diamond. The diamond part right here, o asa nag-meet ang mga fan. Di ba? Kanang murag paypay, di ba? Okay, so we'll stop right here, and on our next meeting, we will discuss the terms from the Visual Dictionary of Architecture. The terms from the Visual Dictionary of Architecture. Okay, so Romanesque architecture. We will continue this one to be continued. And thank you guys for listening my discussion regarding Romanesque architecture. This is just a part. So part 1 na siya. So napa na siya part 2. So I will check if ever we still have another 2 meetings like Tuesday and Thursday, and then usa pa ta maka-exam on the next week. Siguro we can proceed with Gothic architecture. But we will not include Gothic architecture sa ato ang midterm exam. It's just we will tackle it in advance, but we will not include it in our midterm exam. So our midterm exam will be early Christian, Byzantine, and Romanesque architecture. So ato na siyang i-extend ang Gothic architecture so that I can have more time to discuss which is this what I would like na ma-emphasize ang modern architecture. I need more time to discuss modern architecture. Siguro that time siguro muhatag na kog mga recorded videos, kanang recorded discussions if ever di na nato mapas. No, para lang ma-maximize ninyo ang whole subject na di sad masayang inyo ang gibayaran. So, any question so far? Wait, basig na yung mga chat. Sa may mga chat dali. Puro raman gay haha. Tungod ni sa katong nag bad words. Sa quiz later, you could try if you have a good internet, if you have your cams, and if nakaligo mo, pwede mo i-open inyong camera. No. If you don't want to open your camera, okay ra sad, no? But during midterms, i-open niyo yung camera sa device nga inyong gi-use. But I don't require you to have those 2 devices na iPhones dapat na skillet na. I don't require those additional. Mirror, hindi na ako ma-require mirror. Nakatry na ba mo mirror nga naibot ang skillet? Unsay wala pa no. What if
Sir,
ang
why
mirror niya kay
kasangita
fix?
ng mirror, sir?
Lagi mo na lisod no. Buwak pa lang mirror, malas na ba nang mabuwak ang mirror? Malas na malas. What if yung mirror kay fix niya nasa CR? 'Di ba? Fix inyong mirror niya nasa CR nga to, CR mag-take sa exam. Yeah, 7 PM makaana na, ma-access na ninyo ang inyong exam.
Thank you,
Makita
sir.
way answer, 'di ba? Makita way. Yeah, makita ang way answer.